Part 1. The King Who Thought Everything Could Be Conquered. In 525 BCE, Egypt discovered that even a civilization 3,000 years old could fall. Across the eastern desert came the army of Cambyses II, son of Cyrus the Great and ruler of the Persian Empire, a kingdom expanding so rapidly that resistance could begin to look temporary. At Pelusium, near Egypt's eastern gateway, Persian and Egyptian forces collided. Egypt lost. Pharaoh Psamtik III was defeated, Memphis fell, and Cambyses became master of a country whose pyramids were already ancient before Persia existed. Imagine what victory like that does to a ruler's sense of limits. Cambyses had inherited the empire built by Cyrus and pushed it into one of the richest and most prestigious civilizations on earth. Yet beyond the Nile, far to the west, there remained a place that answered to neither Persian soldiers nor Egyptian administrators in the ordinary way. To reach it, you had to leave almost everything behind. The river disappeared, farms disappeared, towns disappeared. The green world of the Nile collapsed into the western desert, where distance could become lethal because the horizon offered almost nothing by which to measure it. Days into that emptiness, however, travelers could encounter something astonishing. Palm trees, springs, olive groves, gardens, houses, human voices. Siwa Oasis seemed almost impossible, a pocket of abundant life surrounded by hundreds of kilometers of desert. And within this isolated world stood something powerful enough that kings wanted its approval: the Oracle of Amun. This was not a curiosity hidden at the edge of Egypt. Oracles mattered because ancient rulers lived in a world where political power and divine legitimacy were deeply intertwined. A sanctuary could possess no army comparable to Persia's and still exercise an authority a king could not simply manufacture. People crossed dangerous country to ask questions there. Priests interpreted the god's response. Reputation traveled farther than armies. And according to the story recorded by the Greek historian Herodotus, Cambyses did not intend to approach Siwa as a pilgrim. After conquering Egypt, he planned 3 ambitious expeditions: against Carthage, against the people Herodotus called the long-lived Ethiopians, and against the Ammonians of Siwa. The Carthaginian campaign never properly began because the Phoenicians in his fleet refused to attack people with whom they had close ancestral ties. The Ethiopian expedition, Herodotus says, became a logistical catastrophe as provisions failed. But towards Siwa, Cambyses issued an order whose consequences would become one of antiquity's greatest mysteries. Herodotus says that while Cambyses was at Thebes, he detached approximately 50,000 men and ordered them to enslave the Ammonians and burn the Oracle of Amun. 50,000. Even if the ancient figure was exaggerated, the story describes not a scouting party, but an overwhelming military force sent toward a remote, sacred community. They departed Thebes with guides and moved west. And then something important happens in Herodotus's account. For a while, we can still follow them. He says they reached a place called Oasis, inhabited by people he identified as Samians, after a journey of 7 days across the desert. The Persian soldiers were still alive, still organized, still moving towards Siwa. From there they entered the next stretch of desert. And that is where ordinary history seems to lose them. They never appear at Siwa. They do not return to Cambyses. No surviving account describes a battle at the Oracle. There is no triumphant Persian report announcing that the sanctuary was burned. Herodotus himself becomes unusually careful. What happened after the army left the known oasis, he says, was known only from what the Ammonians reported and what others heard from them. Their story was extraordinary. Somewhere between the oasis and Siwa, the Persian force stopped for a meal. Around midday, a wind began blowing violently from the south. The wind carried sand. Not a theatrical wall of supernatural darkness, something much more frightening because the desert can actually do it. The storm intensified until, according to the Ammonian account, the soldiers were overwhelmed and buried beneath the sand. An army dispatched by the greatest empire of its age had entered the western desert and vanished before reaching the sacred place it had allegedly been ordered to destroy. No one standing there in the 6th century BCE could have known what this story would become. Cambyses would die only a few years after conquering Egypt. The empire would pass to other kings. The ancient world would change beyond recognition. But the missing army would refuse to disappear from human imagination. Explorers would search for it. Archaeologists would debate it. Claimed discoveries would generate headlines and controversy. Historians would question Herodotus's numbers, his sources.
Part 2. The Army That Never Arrived. An army can lose a battle. It can surrender. It can retreat. Survivors can return carrying stories of what happened. But the force Cambyses allegedly sent towards Siwa left behind something far more difficult to explain: an unfinished journey. According to Herodotus, the Persians had already crossed 7 days of desert and reached the inhabited oasis he describes before continuing toward the Ammonians. After that point, there is no eyewitness Persian account waiting for us. No officer's journal, no casualty list, no message to Cambyses explaining a delay. The next part of the story comes from the people the army had been sent to attack. The Ammonians said the Persians were somewhere between the oasis and Siwa when they stopped to eat. Around midday, a violent southern wind began to blow. Sand swept across the landscape until, according to their account, the entire force disappeared beneath it. It is an extraordinary image. But before imagining 50,000 soldiers frozen beneath one enormous dune, consider what moving an army of that size through the western desert would actually mean. Soldiers need water before they need victory. So do horses, pack animals, and everyone responsible for carrying supplies. Every additional person increases the amount that must be transported, and the supplies themselves require animals and people who also consume water. A military force can therefore become weaker simply by becoming larger. On fertile ground, an army might forage or replenish itself from settlements. Between the Egyptian oases, there were stretches where that assumption could kill you. The route was not empty in the sense that nobody understood it. Desert communities, caravan travelers, and guides possessed knowledge of wells, distances, and conditions. But an imperial army arriving with weapons did not automatically inherit that knowledge. And Cambyses had another campaign that, in Herodotus's telling, demonstrates how quickly imperial ambition could collide with logistics. His expedition southward toward the people Herodotus calls the Ethiopians supposedly advanced without adequate preparation. Food ran out. Soldiers slaughtered pack animals. Herodotus then gives a horrifying account of desperation among the troops before Cambyses finally abandoned the advance and returned. Whatever embellishments may exist in that story, the underlying military truth is brutally ordinary. Persia could defeat Egypt's army, but victory could not create food and water in an empty landscape. So was the Siwa force simply destroyed by the desert? Possibly, but even that answer raises questions. A sandstorm can kill travelers, destroy equipment, erase tracks, and cause catastrophic disorientation. Yet the image of tens of thousands of people being buried simultaneously and leaving an army-sized archaeological deposit has encouraged generations of searchers to expect a spectacular discovery. They have not received one. In 2009, Italian researchers Angelo and Alfredo Castiglione announced that they believed objects and human remains found in Egypt's western desert might be connected to Cambyses' missing army. The announcement raced around the world. Here, perhaps, was the solution after 2.5 millennia. Egyptian archaeological authorities quickly challenged the claim, and the proposed identification never became the accepted answer. The desert kept its mystery. Other researchers have proposed something even more disruptive. Perhaps we've been searching in the wrong way because the army was not destroyed by a sandstorm at all. Egypt did not become peacefully Persian simply because Cambyses won the throne. During the early Persian period, a rebel ruler known as Herodotus IV challenged Persian control. One modern reconstruction has suggested that Cambyses' missing force may have been defeated in connection with that rebellion, and that the famous sandstorm account later obscured an embarrassing Persian military disaster. That possibility changes the entire picture. Imagine what would happen to the legend if an army sent west was defeated rather than swallowed by nature. A political catastrophe can become a desert catastrophe.
What kind of event are we actually looking for? A mass death beneath dunes? A series of losses spread across a desert route? A military defeat? A smaller expedition inflated into 50,000 men? A historical catastrophe transformed into a moral story about a king who challenged a sacred oracle? Each possibility predicts different evidence. Search for one while the truth is another, and you could walk directly across the answer without recognizing it. This is why the missing army remains so compelling. We have not merely misplaced a battlefield. We may have misplaced the event itself. And before deciding what happened to Cambyses' soldiers, there is one person whose testimony must now be investigated. Not because he saw the army disappear, but because almost everything the world remembers about its disappearance reaches us through him, Herodotus. And once we examine the portrait he gives us of Cambyses, another mystery begins to emerge. Was the king who supposedly attacked Siwa really the reckless desecrator history taught us to imagine?
Part 3.
Was Cambyses really the monster of the story? For more than 2,000 years, Cambyses II has carried an extraordinary reputation. In the story many people inherited, he was not simply the Persian king who conquered Egypt, he was the foreign ruler who mocked Egyptian religion, violated sacred customs, attacked temples, and behaved with increasing cruelty until his contempt for things he did not understand became almost a form of madness. Herodotus gives us some of the most memorable episodes. Cambyses allegedly entered sacred places where foreigners were forbidden, ridiculed religious images, ordered ancient royal remains disturbed, and committed acts that horrified the Egyptians. Most famous of all is the story of the Apis bull. At Memphis, the Egyptians celebrated the appearance of Apis, a sacred bull associated with the god Ptah. Cambyses, according to Herodotus, misunderstood the celebration, suspected the Egyptians were rejoicing over Persian misfortune, demanded that the animal be brought before him, and then wounded it with a dagger. The bull later died. It is exactly the kind of episode that seems to explain what supposedly happened at Siwa. A king insults the sacred. A king decides another oracle must be destroyed. An army marches toward it. The army vanishes. Cause and consequence fit together almost too perfectly. But then archaeology enters the story, and the portrait becomes less comfortable. In Egypt, archaeologists found evidence connected with an Apis bull that died during Cambyses' reign. A surviving funerary monument records that the animal received burial at the Serapeum at Saqqara, with Cambyses himself represented in the traditional posture of an Egyptian pharaoh making an offering. Another inscription gives the bull's age at death as more than 19 years and dates that death to Cambyses' 6th regnal year. That evidence does not fit neatly with the simplest version of a crazed foreign king murdering the sacred animal in contempt. Scholars continue debating how the textual and archaeological evidence should be reconciled, but suddenly, the Cambyses we thought we knew becomes harder to see. And there is more. An Egyptian official named Uja, whose autobiographical inscription survives on a remarkable statue now in the Vatican museums, served through the transition from Egyptian to Persian rule. His inscription presents Cambyses using Egyptian royal titles and describes the king taking actions connected with the Temple of Neith at Sais, including restoring its religious personnel and participating in Egyptian religious conventions. Uja had his own political reasons for presenting events as he did, so his inscription is not neutral testimony either. That is precisely the point. We are looking at Cambyses through competing memories. Herodotus preserves stories in which the conqueror repeatedly violates Egyptian sacred traditions. Egyptian evidence can show him functioning as a pharaoh within those same traditions. Neither source allows us to simply climb inside Cambyses' mind. But together, they reveal something far more interesting than the caricature. History may have remembered the conqueror differently depending on who was doing the remembering. Now return to the missing army. The story suddenly changes shape. If later tradition already portrayed Cambyses as the ruler who offended sacred Egypt, what better episode could complete that portrait than an attempt to destroy one of the most prestigious oracles in the desert, followed by the annihilation of the men he sent? This does not mean Herodotus invented the expedition. It does not mean the army survived, and it certainly does not prove the Ammonians fabricated the sandstorm. It means we must ask a question historians constantly face. When an event reaches us through people who believed it carried a moral meaning, how much is event, and how much is interpretation? Herodotus was born decades after Cambyses' conquest. He gathered accounts from a world still living with the consequences of Persian expansion. His work is invaluable precisely because he preserved stories that might otherwise have vanished. But he was not standing beside Cambyses when the order concerning Siwa was issued, nor was he marching with the soldiers when their trail disappeared. Even he signals the boundary of his information. The Persians reached the known Oasis. Beyond that point, the explanation comes from the Ammonians. Think about what that means. The people whose sanctuary was supposedly targeted become the people through whom history learns the fate of the attackers. If you lived at Siwa and an army sent against your sacred oracle never arrived, how would your community remember it? As a logistical failure? As an enemy defeat somewhere beyond your sight? Or as evidence that the power protecting the sanctuary was greater than the king who threatened it? We cannot answer for them. But now the disappearance has three layers: what happened in the desert, what the Ammonians believed happened, and what later historians preserved. Those layers may never perfectly separate again. Then history produces a twist no storyteller would need to invent. Cambyses died in 522 BCE. The Persian Empire survived him and continued ruling Egypt for generations. Siwa survived too. Nearly 2 centuries passed. Then Persia faced another young conqueror advancing with astonishing speed. He defeated Persian armies, entered Egypt, and was welcomed as its new ruler. He could have remained along the Nile. Instead, in 331 BCE, he made a decision that must have sounded strangely familiar. He turned west. He wanted the Oracle of Amun. Once again, a conqueror would cross the desert toward Siwa. But this time, there would be no order to burn the sanctuary, no 50,000-man force sent ahead to impose obedience. The man making this journey wanted something even the greatest army could not give him. He wanted the oracle to answer a question, and his name was Alexander.
Part 4. Alexander walks into the same desert. Alexander had somewhere more urgent to be. It was 331 BCE. Darius III still ruled the Persian Empire. Persian armies remained capable of resistance, and the decisive confrontation between the two kings lay ahead. Alexander had already crossed from Europe into Asia, won at Granicus and Issus, captured Tyre after an extraordinary siege, and entered Egypt. He founded Alexandria on the Mediterranean coast and was recognized within Egyptian royal tradition. The obvious strategic direction was east, back toward Persia. Instead, Alexander went west. His destination lay hundreds of kilometers from the Nile world, Siwa and the Oracle of Amun. Why would one of history's most ambitious commanders interrupt a continental war to visit a sanctuary in an oasis? That question becomes more interesting when we remember that the oracle was not obscure. Its reputation had traveled across the Mediterranean, and Greeks identified Amun with Zeus as Zeus Amun. Alexander may have wanted confirmation of his legitimacy as ruler of Egypt. He may have sought information concerning his future. Ancient traditions would eventually connect the journey with an even more provocative question: whether Alexander possessed divine parentage. Whatever his motivation, he did not summon the oracle to Alexandria. He went to it. The expedition followed the Mediterranean coast before turning inland toward the Oasis, entering country where geography could become as dangerous as an enemy army. Later ancient writers preserved extraordinary stories about what happened along the way. Arrian reports traditions that when Alexander's party lost the route, divine guides appeared. In one account, 2 serpents moved ahead of the expedition, leading it through the desert. Ptolemy, Alexander's companion and later ruler of Egypt, was associated with another version. 2 ravens supposedly flew before the travelers and guided them toward Siwa. These accounts cannot establish miraculous intervention, but they reveal something important about how the journey was remembered. Even Alexander reaching Siwa became legendary. Strip away the serpents and ravens, and the accomplishment remains formidable. Navigation depended on guides, landmarks, water, and conditions in a landscape where wind could erase tracks. Then, after days of desert, green returned. Palms appeared, springs, houses, cultivated earth. Alexander had reached the place Cambyses' army supposedly never saw. And now the story becomes strangely quiet. Alexander entered the sanctuary. A priest received him. He asked questions. The oracle answered. We do not know exactly what was said. Later sources offer different versions. Some say the priest greeted Alexander in language interpreted as calling him the son of Zeus Amun. Some say Alexander asked whether all those responsible for the murder of his father Philip II had been punished. Another tradition says he asked whether he would become master of the world. Ancient authors disagree over wording and circumstances, and Alexander left us no transcript. One account even preserves the tantalizing idea that Alexander intended to tell his mother, Olympias, certain secret responses when he returned to Macedonia. He never returned home alive. Whatever occurred inside Siwa, the visit followed him. Alexander's association with Zeus Amun became part of his developing image, and after his death, coins famously portrayed him with the curved ram's horn associated with the god. Now place 2 scenes beside each other and resist the temptation to explain them. In the first, Cambyses has conquered Egypt. According to Herodotus, he sends a massive force toward Siwa with orders to enslave its people and burn the oracle. The army passes the last recorded oasis and disappears from the story. In the second, Alexander conquers Egypt. He enters the same desert seeking the oracle rather than its destruction. He reaches Siwa, listens, and returns. Cambyses sends soldiers. Alexander goes himself. Cambyses allegedly demands submission. Alexander asks a question. One expedition becomes a mystery of disappearance. The other becomes a mystery of what was said. That does not prove divine punishment or divine favor.
Different routes, guides, seasons, force sizes, supplies, and political circumstances could explain everything without invoking anything supernatural. But imagine how the contrast looked in a world that believed Amun spoke from Siwa. One conqueror threatened the sanctuary and his men never reached it. Another treated the sanctuary as a source of authority and emerged with his legend enlarged. Then history adds one final piece of symmetry. Alexander left Siwa and resumed his campaign. Later, in 331 BCE, at Gaugamela, he decisively defeated Darius III. The Achaemenid Empire, built by Cyrus and inherited by Cambyses, was collapsing into Alexander's hands. The man who had traveled to hear Amun would become master of the empire once ruled by the man accused of trying to silence Amun. Ancient storytellers did not need to invent that reversal. History supplied it. What they did with its meaning is another question. And that leaves us with one final investigation, because today we can strip away the gods, the prophecies, and the moral interpretations, and ask the question modern archaeology should be able to answer. If Cambyses really sent that army, where is it?
Part 5. The desert still hasn't answered. Today we can look down on Egypt's western desert from space. Satellites reveal ridges, ancient waterways, caravan routes, and landscapes no Persian commander could ever have seen from above. Archaeologists can identify settlements buried for millennia. Remote sensing can detect structures invisible at ground level. Genetic analysis can extract information from human remains. An inscription the size of a hand can change our understanding of a king who died 25 centuries ago. Yet all of that technology has not produced the one thing the Cambyses mystery should seemingly allow us to find: an accepted final location for his missing force. Start with the famous explanation. If a sandstorm overwhelmed a huge army in one area, we might expect concentrations of human and animal remains, together with unmistakably 6th century BCE Persian military material. But deserts do not preserve scenes according to our expectations. Dunes migrate. Wind exposes objects and buries them again. Organic material deteriorates. Ancient travelers recover useful metal. Later populations reuse equipment. And if the army did not die simultaneously, there may never have been one enormous graveyard to discover. Now test the logistical explanation. A force losing access to water could fragment over distance. Animals would fail first or be slaughtered. Equipment would be abandoned. Groups might separate while searching for wells. Survivors could attempt to return by different routes. Instead of 50,000 bodies beneath the dune, the archaeological signature might be scattered so widely that individual discoveries would never announce themselves as Cambyses' army. Now test the military explanation.
If Petubastis IV, or forces associated with Egyptian resistance, defeated the Persians, weapons could have been collected, captives taken, bodies stripped, and the battlefield altered by human activity long before archaeology existed. The famous lost army might then be hiding not beneath exceptional preservation, but beneath an incorrect interpretation of an ordinary ancient defeat. Finally, test Herodotus himself. If his figure of 50,000 was exaggerated, modern searches may be looking for an archaeological footprint that never existed at that scale. If geographical names shifted, or his informants compressed several events into one, even the expected route becomes uncertain. Each possibility makes the mystery harder because solving it requires knowing what we are searching for before we find it. And then there is Siwa. The oasis that supposedly awaited destruction survived the Persian period. Its oracle later received Alexander. Its ancient sanctuary became ruin. Its priests disappeared. And the voice people once believed spoke through Amun eventually fell silent. Yet the place remains green against the desert, and that visual fact gives the old story an almost unfair power. We should be careful with it. History cannot tell us that Amun destroyed Cambyses' soldiers. Nothing we possess demonstrates supernatural protection. But history also cannot hand us a complete alternative and say, this is exactly what happened. We are left with evidence, probabilities, and missing pieces. Perhaps one day, an excavation will find a concentration of Persian military material in exactly the right context. Perhaps an inscription will identify a defeated expedition. Perhaps a new reading of an existing text will connect the force to Petubastis. Or perhaps nothing decisive will ever appear because the evidence was dispersed, destroyed, or never existed in the form Herodotus described. That possibility may be the most unsettling of all. Some historical mysteries are not puzzles guaranteed to contain solutions. Time can actually remove the answer. Documents burn, languages disappear, bodies decay, landscapes move, eyewitnesses die without writing. A story survives because the evidence does not. So return one final time to the expedition Herodotus describes. The soldiers leave Thebes. They travel 7 days through desert and reach an inhabited oasis. They replenish themselves and continue west. After that, Herodotus cannot follow them directly. The Ammonians say a southern wind rose while the soldiers were eating and the sand buried them. Modern historians offer other possibilities. Modern expeditions search. Claims are announced. None closes the case. And beyond the point where the Persian trail disappears stands the destination they were allegedly sent to destroy. Siwa. Cambyses died. Persia eventually lost Egypt. Alexander came to the Oracle, received an answer we cannot reconstruct, and died before reaching 40. The sanctuary itself eventually fell silent, but the oasis remained. Somewhere between the last place Herodotus can locate those soldiers and the place they never reached may still lie evidence of a military disaster, a failed expedition, a forgotten battle, or an event whose traces have disappeared completely. We know more about the ancient world than Herodotus could ever have imagined. We can read inscriptions he never saw and excavate graves whose names had already been forgotten in his lifetime. But knowledge is not omniscience. 25 centuries later, the desert has still not told us what happened. Perhaps there were never 50,000. Perhaps rebels killed them. Perhaps thirst dismantled them before the storm finished the job. Perhaps the Ammonians preserved exactly what happened. We do not know. We know only where the soldiers were going. And sometimes the most fascinating thing history leaves behind is not an answer, but a warning against believing that because we cannot explain something, there is nothing left to understand. The army vanished from history. Siwa did not.